Hello and welcome to this evening's Empower Hour. We are very delighted to be joined this evening by Jeremy Nichols, Senior Advocate at the Center for Biological Diversity. I would like now to read the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect as non-native people that the land on which we stand, live, and learn is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that the government, our government, academic, and cultural institutions, and our nation itself were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, oppression, and inequities, and to recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, create, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Let us seek to understand what it means to be in right relationship today with the traditional stewards of this land and with this land itself and with all the creatures that inhabit it. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest, Jeremy Nichols. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Jeremy has over 23 years working in the nonprofit environmental advocacy world with an emphasis on the Western US. He's got extensive experience with public lands and resource management, forest and grassland science and conservation, climate and energy policy, species protection and restoration, environmental law and litigation, fundraising and administration, collaboration and coalition development and management, grassroots and grasstops organizing, communications, and political lobbying. We're not sure if there's anything Jeremy can't do. You are a specialist in campaign strategy and leverage the law to drive social and environmental change. He is apparently particularly fond of the Clean Air Act and the law's ability to empower citizens and communities to successfully confront polluters. He's got an extensive network across the US, including elected officials, agency leaders, activists, frontline communities, non-governmental organizations, scientists, academics, and more. Fun fact is, excuse me, I should also mention Jeremy is currently working as the senior advocate with the Center for Biological Diversity in their environmental health program. And the fun fact is that he is an avid birder. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, you did a deep dive on my LinkedIn page. Thank you for all that. And thank you to everybody with Empower Our Future for inviting me here tonight. I really appreciate all the work that you all are doing to inspire action around the climate and to help share more information with the world in terms of what folks are doing to make a difference. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today on the webinar. Really appreciate it. I see a lot of familiar names, so looking forward to some good question and answer after my presentation. I'm going to share a few brief slides, some brief background on what we're working on right now in terms of holding the oil and gas industry accountable and leveraging the Clean Air Act to do so. And with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get on with it. Great. Well, thank you again, everybody. Let me. As I got a grand introduction, so I don't really need to do more. But thank you, everybody. Yes, I'm Jeremy Nichols. I'm the senior advocate with the Center for Biological Diversity. Appreciate this opportunity to share a bit of what we're doing right now to hold the oil and gas industry accountable. As Mary indicated, I've been working on mainly clean air issues and climate issues for quite a bit, but about the past 20 years. A lot of focus here in Colorado, but working on the Western US. Worked in various capacities over the years. I'm now working with the Center for Biological Diversity. Center for Biological Diversity, many of you have probably heard of the organization. It's noted for its emphasis on species conservation, leveraging the Endangered Species Act. But the organization is so much more and recognizes that to protect species, to protect our environment, to protect the planet, we also have to focus on public health and the inextricable link with environmental health. And so I work with the environmental health program. As part of that, my big focus is on air quality issues, primarily in Colorado, and primarily working to expose the true cost of the fossil fuel industry's air pollution, with the understanding that air quality is inextricably linked with the state of our climate. The very same emissions that are released that harm public health and that create ozone, for example, and smog are tied with the very same emissions that are fueling the climate crisis. So focusing on clean air and leveraging the Clean Air Act is a great opportunity to advance both public health protection and action for the climate. A lot of my focus right now is on the oil and gas sector, the oil and gas production and processing industry here in Colorado, and finding ways to leverage the Clean Air Act to expose the true costs of drilling and fracking here in Colorado, and find ways to tighten the screws on the industry, make it harder for them to pollute, to wantonly pollute, make it more costly for them to do business. As we all know, the costs of oil and gas are tremendous. We know that in terms of the costs of the climate crisis, the costs of declining air quality, water pollution, destruction of wildlife habitat. But unfortunately, in reality, the true costs are borne by us. And we're trying to turn the tables and make sure that industry is the one that's accounting for the cost of its pollution and shouldering us with the burden of its greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful air pollutants. A big focus of my work right now is on two main activities that the oil and gas industry engages in. It's venting and flaring. Venting and flaring are common practices in the oil and gas industry. They're incredibly wasteful practices. It's basically a way that the oil and gas industry gets rid of its waste by either venting it directly into the air or burning it off, and of course releasing the attendant air pollution through that practice. And venting and flaring has come under a lot of fire in recent years because it is wasteful, for one, but also because of its contribution to various air pollution problems and the greenhouse gas emissions that are tied to venting. And here in Colorado, venting and flaring is linked to a group of pollutants that are notoriously harmful to public health and to the climate. There are a group of pollutants called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and I'm sure folks have probably heard that term thrown around, VOCs. VOCs not only include substances like cancer-causing benzene, but they include methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. They are also key contributors to ground level ozone, which is the key ingredient of smog. And the Front Range region of Colorado in particular has been struggling to meet federal health standards for smog for many years now, actually going on 17 years. So it's a huge problem. Venting and flaring is a major problem. And we've probably all heard and have been led to believe that Colorado has adopted rules that actually prohibits venting and flaring, and that it's not a common practice anymore because we have, quote, tough rules on the books that are curtailing the activity. I unfortunately have some bad news to share. Flaring and venting is not prohibited. It is, in fact, rampant in Colorado. And that's because the rules that were adopted by what's now known as the Energy and Carbon Management Commission provided that routine venting and flaring was prohibited except where authorized by the Air Pollution Control Division. And the Air Pollution Control Division has seen to it to grant permission for the oil and gas industry to vent at pretty much every oil and gas production and processing facility in the state. They do it under the auspices, one, of controlling emissions, so flaring in their mind controls VOC emissions, and then venting they approve simply because industry wants to be able to vent. The reality is that flaring and venting has not been banned in Colorado, that it is as common as ever. And just to highlight a few examples of what I'm talking about in terms of where we're most concerned about venting and flaring. This is a well site with a few pieces of equipment, some compressor engines, dehydrators, separators, and venting routinely occurs at these pieces of equipment. Not because industry has to, it's because they're choosing to. It's easier for them to, and the Air Division readily approves their request to be able to vent from these sources. We're not talking about huge releases, but a lot of small releases over a long period of time adds up, and that's a big concern. Another big source are tanks, tank farms for tank batteries you'll see at oil and gas well sites. Lots of routine venting happening at these tanks, whether it's the hatches opening or pressure release valves opening up. Lots of what is called routine venting happens here. And then flares, the flaring that goes on. We're not talking about flares that are obscenely visible, open flame and like something akin to like the Suncor oil refinery. These are often enclosed with metal cylinders, large metal cylinders. And so each one of these cylinders in this image is an individual flare. And well sites sometimes have very small ones, which are called burners sometimes. Sometimes they have massive ones, that are 10 feet wide or larger, burning huge amounts of gas. And if you pay attention as you're out seeing oil and gas development in Weld County or near Boulder, you'll see these flares at every single well site. They're ubiquitous, and it is a sign that flaring is happening pretty much everywhere at all times, notwithstanding the quote prohibition on flaring. So we have a problem. Venting and flaring has not been prohibited. It is happening, it's ubiquitous, but compounding things, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news here. Oh, here's a picture. You can see a lot of times these flares, the heat signature from them. You don't see the flame itself, but obviously there's some heat going on in these cylinders, which is a telltale sign that flaring is happening. But compounding the problem is that the Air Division is exercising a very inadequate oversight of venting and flaring. And they rely on a lot of assumptions that venting and flaring is happening according to certain limits or certain standards. For example, flaring, the Air Division generally presumes that flaring is reducing emissions by 95% or more at all times. That's an assumption that they will fall on their sword for. And with venting and flaring, they often establish numerical limits. Problem is, there is usually no monitoring or actual measurement of emissions to confirm whether companies are actually meeting these limits. For example, no monitoring to assure that flares are actually achieving 95% reduction of emissions at all times. And same with venting and flaring, no monitoring. Simply, the Air Division imposes a numeric limit, 2 tons per year, for example, and then it's just presumed that the company will meet it. It's a very trust us type approach to overseeing the oil and gas industry. And that's a huge problem. One, with flaring, there's some testing that has actually been conducted, and we are finding that flares are routinely failing to achieve the promised control efficiencies. So we have come across test results done mainly by the companies, and amazingly, the Air Division has come into possession of those reports, showing flares achieving sometimes as low as 20%, 40%, 60%. But even a control efficiency of 90% is not 95. And considering their claims that they're reducing emissions by 95% or more, that's very concerning. And the venting limits we're increasingly seeing are simply shams and effective loopholes in permits. Companies get permission from the Air Division to vent. There is ostensibly a numeric limit, but there is nothing in these permits or any of the oversight that guarantees that companies won't exceed that limit. So they are effective loopholes. And that's concerning because even though there are purported estimates of emissions in terms of both VOCs and greenhouse gases from the industry, we really don't know. The bottom line is we don't know what the industry is actually releasing, how much. And it's incredibly concerning because so much of the effectiveness of both our efforts to control air pollution and reduce ozone, for example, in the Front Range, but also meet very aggressive greenhouse gas emission targets, rest upon these assumptions that flares are working and that venting is being limited according to the promises made by these companies. And we're not seeing signs that that's actually happening. So what are we doing about it? With the Center for Biological Diversity now, we are focusing on leveraging the Clean Air Act to call attention to the fact that the state of Colorado is not adequately permitting venting and flaring. With flaring, we're directly challenging the assumption that flaring is 95% effective at all times. We're primarily focused on individual permits for facilities, well sites, production or processing facilities, and in particular facilities subject to a permitting program under the Clean Air Act called Title V operating permitting. These permits apply to the biggest and dirtiest sources of air pollution, but more importantly, they provide an opportunity to petition the EPA to intervene and object to permits that don't comply with the Clean Air Act. And we have successfully used these petitions to get the EPA to object to at least 7 permits so far this year. And we have a number of other petitions in the hopper right now that we're looking to file. And we're not trying to win facility by facility. That's not sustainable. But what we're trying to do is build a body of case law through these Title V petitions where we can ultimately leverage the Air Division on a more systematic level. In effect, it's kind of like snowball advocacy, where we're building the snowball flake by flake, getting it bigger and bigger such that the momentum can't be ignored anymore. And we're hoping to build on this success in the context of flaring. Just to give you an example, I want to give a shout out, take advantage of this opportunity to give a shout out to our partners with the organization Earthworks, which uses infrared cameras to help expose the industry's true pollution. Their emissions are often not visible to the naked eye. And their infrared thermography, their cameras, and their field organizer, Andrew Klooster in Colorado, has done tremendous work to go to facilities, expose what's really going on, what we're not seeing, and to call attention to the fact that things aren't operating the way they should be. And here, Andrew, at a recent oil and gas well site, confirmed just that. Here you have flares that aren't combusting effectively. The gas that's coming out of the stacks there, that's unburned VOCs, so unburned methane, unburned benzene, and other VOCs. And this is confirming that these flares aren't operating at 95% control efficiency. And it just exposes, like Andrew went out there and just went to a site and he sees this all the time. And so what we're trying to do is to leverage then the legal liabilities that flow from this. We have the imagery. Now, how do we add some teeth to it and compel the EPA to intervene and to hold the state accountable to responding here? So that's one example. So with venting, we're taking a similar approach, except we're actually challenging a number of permits directly in state court. So we are, in some respects, utilizing the EPA Title V petitions and requesting that the EPA intervene, but we're actually trying to hit them directly in court over routine venting permissions that they've offered. And one of the big cases that we have is challenging the state's approval of what's called a general permit for what's called routine or predictable gas venting emissions. The general permit is basically a streamlined permit that companies can apply for coverage and not have to get an individual permit that is often more rigorous and subject to more scrutiny. So this is basically gives companies cover to get permission for the Air Division to vent as much gas as they want. Ostensibly, there are limits in this permit, but the permit doesn't actually require any kind of monitoring or verification of what's actually being vented. And so they are, in essence, free pass to pollute. And want to, again, kind of leaning on Earthworks and Andrew Klooster's video work, just to give you a sense of the routine venting and flaring that is going completely unchecked. Here you have some tanks and you have a pressure release valve that's opened up and just spewing gas. And there is no system in place to measure what's coming out of that valve and to verify that it's actually complying with the limits, whether it's in the general permit or some other permit issued by the Air Division. And so it's a huge problem that venting and flaring actually does happen anyway, even though it's supposedly prohibited, but it's going completely unchecked, which is adding a whole other layer of concern, but also giving us opportunities to call attention to the issue and to do something about it. And so, yeah, so we are pushing the envelope here. We're filing petition after petition with the EPA to object, focusing on flaring. We actually just filed a petition today with the EPA over a gas compressor station in Morgan County, where routine venting was approved, and we're challenging the division's failure to assure that venting will stay below what they believe to be de minimis levels. And we're hoping the EPA grants our petition. We also have, as I mentioned, we're challenging the general permit for routine venting in the Colorado Court of Appeals right now. And we actually just filed suit over 2 air permits that were issued to Crestone Peak Operating for some very large oil and gas facilities in Adams County, where the state, the division again, just presumed that VOC emissions would be reduced by 95% by virtue of a flare being out there. But there's no monitoring to verify the flare is operating effectively at all times. It's an unfounded assumption, and it's a recipe for disaster, really, because with no checks in place to ensure the flare is actually operating, there's no telling how much pollution will actually be released to these well sites. And even though these well sites are two individual well sites among thousands and thousands of oil and gas wells along the Front Range, again, we're trying to build a body of case law. We're trying to set some precedent here that we can then wield at a much broader scale, and hopefully, again, create the snowball that is that leads to the change that will be that the state air division can just not avoid any further. And in doing so, we're trying to core argument that we make is that industry needs to be held accountable to better monitoring requirements. But better monitoring means spending more money to monitor. It means exposing companies being exposed to greater liability. But we also believe that we'll reach a point where federal regulators possibly will have to acknowledge that it's simply not possible to permit venting and flaring with any assurance that any limits will actually be met. It's a reflection of the fact that the oil and gas industry is inherently dirty, it's inherently wasteful, and that you can establish all the limits you want, but at the end of the day, there's simply no way to assure accountability. And the more that we can expose that and help people understand, like, this industry can't operate but for skirting clean air laws and but for relying on free passes to pollute, that will be key to helping to advance a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. We know that ultimately we need to phase out oil and gas extraction in Colorado. Exposing the clean air costs is one key way that we can do that and help collectively move the ball forward there. And the time is of the essence. This is a headline that just came out today in E&E News, which is an online publication, about how the oil and gas industry's greenhouse gas emissions are rising, even as emissions in other sectors are declining. And this doesn't even account for the fact that we have inadequate systems of checks to ensure that venting and flaring happens according to assumed limits and assumed control efficiencies. So as a baseline, the industry's climate footprint is just worsening every year, it appears. And the lack of accountability here in Colorado is fueling that. So we're trying to hold industry accountable to its promises, its commitments, and then ensuring the state regulators follow through to do their job, to do it effectively. So covered a lot of ground there. I know there's probably a lot of great questions I want to make sure we have time to answer. Here's my contact information. There's a link to the presentation here. I think this is going to be recorded as well, so it'll be available. If folks want, sign up to take action on the Center for Biological Diversity's website. We obviously do a lot of work other than air quality and climate, but it is pretty core to our overall portfolio. I encourage folks to keep tabs on what we're doing. I know when it comes to the work I'm doing with the environmental health program, we're building a lot of really amazing success, I feel like. It's disheartening in some ways, but we are winning with some of these EPA petitions and with these strategies and tactics that we're building upon. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to chip away at this facade of effective oversight of venting and flaring. And one good way to keep tabs on what we're doing and opportunities to weigh in to help us make a difference. We do periodically send alerts out targeting Governor Polis on these issues, and working to ensure that our people power, that we're leveraging our people power as much as we're leveraging our legal power. I think together it all adds up to some really important power building that is going to be key to actually phasing out fossil fuels here in Colorado. So with that, I'm going to stop share, and I would love to get to question and answer. Bring off the first question. Awesome to see. Thanks, Leslie. And great question about why the Air Pollution Control Division has been so ineffective, and if there are any bright spots. The Air Pollution Control Division culturally is still catching up to where Colorado needs to be. The agency as a whole has been very much about serving industry over the years, and they don't believe their job is to second guess industry when it comes to assumptions around controls, meeting limits, things like that. So when a company like Civitas or Crestone says we're going to comply with a 2-ton per year limit on venting, the Air Division says, okay, sounds good. And it's a problem, that cultural side of things, but it also means that we just need to dig in more deeply than we ever have before. And I will say that the level of petitions we've filed and lawsuits that have been filed over from the environmental side over air permitting in the last couple of years has hit a historic high. It's not enough, but it's more pressure that the Air Division has faced than ever before. And I think that that's a bright spot. The fact that we are finding these discrepancies, these areas of ineffective oversight, and actually holding them accountable. That's really helpful. And with the EPA is in some respects suffering from some of the same issues, but part of it is I don't think we've presented the issue to them as effectively as we have in the last couple of years. And as evidenced with these recent Title V petition wins, these EPA rulings objecting to state issued permits, I think it speaks to the fact that we're presenting the arguments more effectively than ever before. We've become more sophisticated. And I think that that's a really good thing. I think all around, a lot of the work that we're doing on climate, clean air, transition, we're becoming more sophisticated and finding the ways to win. And EPA is going along with us, which is very heartening. We'll see where things go after this election, but I'm not going to go there right now. I'm going to stay hopeful. So another question, why didn't oil and gas people want to comply? Is it cost? What else? So venting and flaring is it is waste disposal, basically. And venting and flaring is a very easy way to dispose of waste, very easy and cost effective. Venting is bad, but they're not venting amounts of gas that are so high that it's actually hitting their economic bottom line. They can afford to waste a lot of gas and still make money. And they would rather do that rather than spend the money to take precautions to close their systems more and to prevent venting to the fullest extent possible. Same with flaring. Flares are very cheap to install, very cheap to operate. They're very simple. It's a great way for the industry to reduce to deal with its waste. And because they're spending nominal amounts of money to dispose of it, but at the end of the day, they're not spending much money at all. It would be like us just throwing our garbage into the street and expecting somebody else to deal with it. And that's basically what venting and flaring is. So and that's one of the things we need to change, is that there needs to be an incentive for them not to do it. There's not, I don't think, a sufficient economic incentive, so we need to create more of a legal incentive for them to do the right thing. And if I'm not answering these fully, please follow up. I really appreciate all this back and forth, so thank you. And Lauren, thanks. I see your question here. Do you know of any other states that better restrict venting and flaring? No, I don't. We see, relatively, Colorado is better than others. New Mexico has been really bad in terms of their rules, and they don't even have limits on venting. They just let industry claim to vent as much as it wants. California has made some strides, but we still see permits from California where that 95% control assumption for flaring is just assumed, and there's no monitoring in place to verify it. So it's quite a problem, and I think it's reflective of the fact that industry over the years has really spun this tale that flaring is just the be-all end-all, and that it's going to operate it impeccably at all times, and it's simply not the case. And we're actually seeing data to confirm that.
Jeremy, we have a question here from another member of Empower Our Future, and it is, roughly what percentage of flaring is visible, and what can we tell friends and family and colleagues that flaring actually does? And also in Colorado, is there legislation that could bolster the venting or flaring controls and accountability?
Yeah, thanks for flagging that. And thanks, Julie. Great question. So We don't know. I mean, the percentage of flaring that's visible, it's much smaller. I can only offer you an anecdotal observation. Probably like less than 5% of all flaring that happens is actually an open flare that's visible. Most all flaring that happens in Colorado is with these enclosed flares now. But at the end of the day, it's a flare is a flare, and so it's still happening. What flaring actually does, I mean, it's breaking down volatile organic compounds into substances that are relatively less harmful, but still contribute to public health and climate concerns. The real issue comes into play where a flare is not working effectively. So flares are burning off things like benzene, and the combustion process converts it to less harmful substances. Ideally, it's carbon dioxide and water. That's the perfect byproduct of combustion. That doesn't happen all the time. So we get other impurities like carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides. But if the flare is not working effectively, then there are a lot of unburned volatile organic compounds that are released, including benzene. So wherever there's a flare, there's cause for concern that there are toxic emissions like benzene being released. There's certainly combustion byproducts like carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides are a respiratory irritant. And then just more generally, those emissions contribute to both the smog problem here in Colorado along the Front Range and also our source of greenhouse gas emissions. In Colorado, the legislation, I mean, I don't have anything specific to offer right now. It hasn't been an emphasis quite yet, but absolutely the legislature can speak to this and make clear that prohibition on venting and flaring should mean a prohibition on venting and flaring. The approval of venting and flaring for air pollution purposes should be the exception and not the norm. And perhaps legislation can help to change that and make clear that their current practices are unacceptable. I'll get back to the question and answer here. There's a question from Christine. Which species are most impacted other than humans? That's a great question. It runs the gamut. If you consider the greenhouse gas emissions that are released from venting and flaring, then obviously that's a lot of critters that are impacted. Ozone impacts species, both plant species, but also it's increasingly been documented to impact the health of birds, which is something that's very concerning to me. In general, as a respiratory irritant, ozone does impact wildlife. We don't quite know the full extent, but it does impact them. And then the air toxics, the things like benzene and whatnot, we have less information on how that impacts species. But we always operate under the assumption that if something is bad for public health, human health, it's not good for the environment, period, and is not good for other species. So hope that answers that question. RJ's got a question about the EPA Air Now app. That app tells you what's going on with air quality in real time. It focuses primarily on particulate matter and ozone pollution. And it can be a really helpful app for giving you an indication of how good or bad the air might be regionally in the area. But it's not as localized. So it's not going to give you a sense of like how is a flaring event or a venting event happening, impacting the air quality that may be nearby where you live. But it's a great app to track, especially in the summertime when ozone is such a big problem along the Front Range. For anybody who's sensitive to air quality, it's a great way to like get an initial impression about how the day is and what, if anything, you might need to do to avoid being impacted. So Jan's got a question about industry playing other games around permitting and breaking down their operations into smaller sources of air pollution. And that's a big issue for sure. And Jan, you're right. Legislation was attempted that would require what's called aggregation of oil and gas activities to truly measure like how big of a source of air pollution they are. But yes, oil and gas industry does attempt to make it seem as if its operations are smaller than otherwise, even though they're all connected and functioning together. And that's an issue we're trying to keep tabs on as well, because the Clean Air Act does have some standards for what's called aggregation. And Yes, industry does get away with it sometimes. It's an issue we need to keep tabs on to make sure that they're not fully avoiding it. Along the Front Range, it's helped that some of the permitting thresholds have gone down because of how bad the air quality is. So it's become harder for them to avoid the more stringent permitting, but it's still a problem. It's actually a problem nationally. There's a whole saga that's unfolded over the past decade or so about how industry has fought what's called aggregation and has leveraged some pretty horrendous court rulings to convince EPA to go along with it. That's a presentation for another day, but it's something to keep tabs on for sure. Leslie, you have a question, any provisions in state statutes that are strong enough to provide legal basis for challenging permits? Yes, I mean, can statutes always be made stronger? Absolutely. We have standards in the statutes right now that say that permits have to be enforceable and have to demonstrate that they can comply with all the applicable requirements. Well, one of the applicable requirements is reducing emissions by 95%. And if you don't have monitoring, you can't show that you're complying, you will comply with that limit. So ostensibly the statutes are helpful, but we could always use stronger, more precise statutes. And of course, we're up against, I mean, we're in court right now with judges who are pretty new to these issues. Environmental cases don't get litigated often in state court. So there's a bit of a learning curve that we're facing, and hopefully we'll overcome that. But for many judges who deal, day to day with like criminal issues, trials and whatnot, the environmental cases make their eyes glaze over to no end. And so hopefully we can help them see the light and help them understand that there are statutes, there are standards, and that the air division should be scrutinized as closely as possible, given the implications of these issues. See, Eric has a question. Should Colorado state legislators consider new legislation better control oil and gas emissions? Always, I would say, always legislators should consider new legislation to ratchet down on the oil and gas industry. We need broader political support. Governor Polis has shown that he is not willing to defend people and communities when it comes to standing up to the oil and gas industry. And that's a problem. That's an impediment to getting legislation passed. So we need to continue to focus on building the power we need to influence politics. But yes, ideally legislation can and hopefully will be passed that will continue to strengthen our clean air safeguards and really expose the fact that the industry needs to be phased out. Lauren, another question. Do you foresee rulemaking or legislation to address this? I don't know. That's a really good question. Legislation probably is needed at this point. Rulemakings, at least dealing with air issues, go before the Air Quality Control Commission. And the Air Commission is a 9-member board of volunteers who are appointed by the governor. And 7 of the commissioners now have pretty direct ties to the oil and gas industry. So Polis has made sure to stack the commission with people who aren't willing to stand up to the oil and gas industry or second guess them. There are 2 people who work directly for oil and gas companies who are on the commission right now. There's only 1 person who works for an environmental NGO. So it's a tough board to be up against when it comes to advocating for stronger rules. But legislation at some point is probably needed. But we also, the legal pressure and the legal leverage is so important for really emphasizing the power that we have. The more we win lawsuits, the more we win petitions, the more it puts the state in a corner and forces them to have to deal with this issue, whether they like to or not. And the more people power we have in place, the more political influence we're wielding, the better the chances are that we'll get the change that we need, and we'll get it when we need it. So I hope that answered your question, Leslie. KK, you have a question. Didn't EPA set a no waste rule for flaring? Does that only apply to operations on federal lands? The EPA's no waste rule for flaring is entirely premised on the assumption that flaring reduces emissions by 95%. EPA's rules suffer from the same blind assumptions that we're seeing affect Colorado's rules, unfortunately. Colorado's rules don't, or the EPA's rules don't require monitoring of flaring to guarantee or verify flare efficiency, control efficiency. And it's a big issue. Now they're banking on industry being better than not, even though there may be some instances where flaring doesn't work, that on the whole, it will do a good job of reducing overall emissions. But that's, while well-intentioned, I don't think it's the right assumption to make. And unfortunately, we're not seeing the EPA recognize that there are methods out there for measuring emissions, that there are monitoring systems that can be put in place to continuously monitor flares. And unfortunately, they're taking an easier way out. So we have a lot of work to do, even though there is ostensibly a quote no waste rule in place at a federal level. It's not foolproof, and it's not again, it's subject to the same flawed assumptions that are plaguing the Colorado regulations as well. Again, better than nothing, and on the whole, more good than not, but we need to do better when it comes to climate and clean air. Amy has a question. A new study released by Union of Concerned Scientists describes how power plants are the major source of emissions with many sources. Yes, power plants are still a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and still a huge problem. One thing I didn't touch on, which I'll throw out here, is that our work to confront the oil and gas industry, yes, it's about confronting its pollution, its direct impacts to our clean air and our climate. But also, it's a recognition that the oil and gas industry still wields tremendous political power. And that political power is used to ensure that utilities maintain or stay beholden to fossil fuel interests, and that rather than transitioning to renewables, they transition to gas instead. The oil and gas industry is behind efforts to transition homes to being all electric, to banning gas-fired water heaters and other appliances. And so it's really important to recognize that this is about confronting political power as well. Our power plants, we need to move beyond fossil fuels. And I think to do so, ultimately, we need to get the oil and gas industry out of the way. Jim's got some questions. Are there lawsuits based on health effects of ozone and carcinogens caused by fracking? Not so much, no. Those cases are very hard to develop and to prove. And so there's not a lot that's happening there. There are in some cases some very unfortunate incidences where oil and gas well pollution does directly impact a nearby homeowner. And those homeowners often do take some legal action, but nothing on a broader scale that's about influencing both policy and broader industry practice. So that's not happening. And you have a question about the oil and gas industry's influence on politics. I don't have a good answer for you there in terms of donations, like actual monetary donations. Suffice it to say that I think the oil and gas industry's influence is likely very pervasive, probably in a lot of ways that we don't really and fully understand. So let's see, I'm kind of moving on. There's so Leslie, you've got some great questions. I'm going to get to a couple others from some new folks who are asking some new questions. So Tracy Burnett, thanks Tracy. Has there been any progress recently in using LiDAR technology to locate venting bad actors? Yes, there has been increasing focus on using like flyovers and other technology to directly detect venting, especially venting of what are called super emitters. So a lot of times venting is very small amounts over long periods of time, but sometimes it's a huge amount over a very short period of time. And they are working to mobilize technologies to better discover and to deal with those kinds of venting emissions. But I don't think there's the challenge is because the state has started to issue all these permits that actually set limits. What we need are numbers. We need numbers to verify, are the emissions higher than the permitted level? And unfortunately, the LiDAR technology is coming along, but it's not to the point where we can reliably use that data to then quantify what's being vented. And that's been a challenge, like with Earthworks and Andrew Klooster's work. He's doing great work qualitatively exposing the emissions that are being released. Unfortunately, the technology is not able to yield a quantitative figure in terms of how much is actually being released. And so much of air pollution regulation relies on numeric limits, 2 tons, 10 tons, 5 tons. And unless we can show that emissions are above those limits, there's often not a lot we can do. So we need to continue to, find new and more advanced technologies to discover those problems and those discrepancies. But we also need to recognize that the way that air pollution is regulated makes it rife for industry abuse, even as we have these very advanced LiDAR and other infrared technologies that are being used to discover the emissions. It's unfortunate, but it underscores why we need to be attacking this problem aggressively. And let's see, Bobby, you had a question here, and then I'll get to some of the others that have come up. Thanks, Bobby, for that question. What is the 95% assumption based on? Where did that number come from? Yeah, that number is based on flare manufacturers doing tests in controlled labs. There are manufacturers of flares, and they will set up a flare in a lab, an indoor lab at their manufacturing center, and they'll fire up the flare, and they'll do a test, and they'll say, "Wow, this flare is amazing! It achieves 95% control at all times, so long as there's a flare operating, and so long as gas is moving through." It's a very different story when you take a flare and put it in the middle of the plains in Weld County, where you have blizzards in the wintertime, thunderstorms in the summertime, and who knows what else going on at all times. And that's what we're seeing, is that these flares aren't built to withstand and to be reliable in the elements. And it seems pretty straightforward and common sense, but the regulators, we've had a very difficult time getting them to acknowledge that that's the reality. So the 95% remains the assumption, and they point to the manufacturers, but the reality on the ground is much, much different, and that's underscoring why we're focused on this so much. Leslie, I have a question around the estimate of air pollution from oil and gas. I don't have one off the top of my head. I will say that they are the biggest source of volatile organic compound emissions. The leading source of ozone forming VOCs, and their combustion emissions, actually the NOx, nitrogen oxide, which is another ozone forming pollutant, and it's a byproduct of combustion like flaring. They're up there. I think they're either number 2 or number 3 in terms of a source. So they're large, they're substantial, and it's why there has been so much focus on oil and gas over the years. And it's why there's so much concern right now that if the emissions are high to begin with, but if they're being underestimated, wow, then what is the true impact to our air quality, and what is the true cost of what we're bearing? So KK, you had another question around private parties and concerned citizens. How can we best engage? I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't have a fully formed answer right now, because there are ideas that I have. Andrew Klooster with Earthworks is doing a great job getting people in the field and helping people understand what's happening. And in many respects, we need to do more of that. We need people to, if you're driving through Weld County for some reason, and you see a flare that is doing something it shouldn't, we want to make sure people can understand when that situation is happening. If there's a flare that might be malfunctioning, how can you document it? How can you observe it? For a lot of people, seeing an oil and gas well site, it's completely foreign. You have no idea what's going on there. But there are some things I can tell you to pay attention for, where if you were out there and saw it, you could document it and bring it to somebody like Andrew or myself, and we could see what we can do with it. Things like a flare smoking, soot coming from a flare stack. That's a big problem. That's a big no-no. And if you ever see that, that's something to document. So we probably need to work more on getting, not only informing people about what's happening, but finding the ways to help people better document and better report what they're seeing. Because that's the crazy thing, is that these oil and gas wells, they're not invisible. They're all over the place. And so there should be eyes on every well site at some point over the year, if not many eyes over a year. And so how do we ensure that as those eyes are on those wells, that we're able to observe things potentially going wrong? There's things we can do with that, and so we need to figure out how to better develop that citizen monitoring network. Ooh, okay, so I think I'm getting everybody here. Christine had a question. Are there technologies in progress that could automate emissions from the stack for flaring as there are with SEMS devices? SEMS are continuous emission monitoring systems. And absolutely, that's something that it's still developing, but we're seeing it used, especially in some petrochemical operations. These are devices in like stacks that are continuously monitoring pollution. So if a flare is not working properly, it automatically detects it and reports it. And we have that data. And that's something that's not happening in regards to flaring here in Colorado, but it could. And that's something we're really trying to work toward. One, that gives us better data and assures accountability. But two, SEMS are really advanced monitoring systems and very costly. And we think it's reasonable to expect industry to pay that cost because they're not paying it right now. And I think that's a good thing. We want to make it more costly. We want the industry to shoulder the costs. These aren't costs that don't exist. These are costs that we're shouldering right now. We need to turn those tables. So it's something that very much we're focused on advancing. Leslie, I'm going to get to the dirty deal question in just a sec, and your letter. Thank you for acknowledging that. Lauren, you had a question around requiring regular inspections of flare permits. Yes. The problem is we need a much more rigorous system of inspections. Right now, literally inspections of flares amount to somebody going out to a well site and turning their head sideways and peeking to see whether there's a flame in the flare. And just because there's a flame doesn't mean it's working effectively. And so we need to get beyond that. And there are ways, they should monitor and they should go out to inspect for things like, is there a flame in place? But then there should be other ways that they undertake inspections where they trigger testing or more rigorous monitoring. One of the things that we've been pushing for is that the infrared cameras, that they be used on a very frequent basis to see whether there's unburned gas coming out of a flare or whether venting may be happening in a very inappropriate place. Something akin to like what Andrew's doing with Earthworks. Andrew's going out there and documenting this stuff. What Andrew is seeing should spur the companies to immediately shut down their operations and to fix whatever's wrong. Unfortunately, that's not how it plays out, but that's where we need to get to. But we need to get the companies and to get the state and the oil and gas inspectors to that point where if they see something wrong, things need to shut down so that something can be fixed. And that's not happening right now, but we need to get to that point. Yes, so Leslie's talking about the dirty deal from the legislative session where the governor coerced a lot of groups to agree to and legislative leaders to not propose any legislation that impacts the oil and gas industry or to propose any ballot initiatives until 2027, conveniently after his second term ends. And it's a gentleman's deal. There's no signed agreement or anything like that. But I think we don't need to get into all the dynamics behind it, but a lot of folks felt like the governor made clear he wasn't going to stand up to defend the need to confront the oil and gas industry, that he was going to go to bat for the oil and gas industry. And that creates a very unfortunate political dynamic to navigate for groups like ours and others on this webinar tonight. It doesn't mean that legislation can't be proposed, but it certainly means that the political power needed to get legislation passed, effective legislation passed, or to otherwise, continue to make progress in confronting the oil and gas industry, we don't have as much as we need, and we need to focus on building that right now, and to take advantage of the legal leverage that we have to build that power. Keep building the people power that we're working on. I know folks have done such an amazing job of rallying support, getting people to testify in support of phase out legislation and the like. We need to continue to do that. But it also probably needs to be with an eye toward who the next governor might be, which means we might have to wait a couple years, but that gives us a chance to regroup and to, again, build the power we need to save the day ultimately. There's a lot that we could talk about there. I wish we could do more back and forth. The webinar format, it's a little one-sided. But feel free to follow up with me if anybody wants to chat more about some of this stuff. Like I said, my contact info is in the presentation, and I'm pretty easily found online. Leslie, you had a question too about coalition letter today that was submitted to the governor. Yes, several groups, including the Center, Clean Energy Action, Cultivando, Women from the Mountain, sent a letter to the governor calling on the governor to request EPA to classify the Denver Metro North Front Range region as an extreme ozone non-attainment area. Extreme means the problem is really bad, but it also it gives states the strongest tools under the Clean Air Act to be able to confront ozone pollution and to beat the problem. And right now, if the state continues to fail to meet ozone standards by 2027, the Clean Air Act will require that the region be classified as an extreme non-attainment area. Our letter today calls on the governor to accelerate that process and make it happen now, so that we can avail ourselves of the tools, the strongest tools under the Clean Air Act now, and not have to wait until after 2027. And part of the reason why we're making this request is because of how bad the ozone was this past summer. This summer was one of the worst in several years. Many days of ozone, high ozone above federal health limits. We're violating federal ozone standards worse than we have in the last at least 7 years. To bring the area into compliance, we basically need to have like impeccably clean summers for the next 2 years. And that's, as much as I hope that happens, please, I mean, absolutely, I hope it happens, but it doesn't seem likely given our trajectory so far. So rather than just wait and hope for the best, let's avail ourselves of the best tools possible under the Clean Air Act. One of those tools is that an extreme non-attainment area requires permitting thresholds to be dropped from 25 tons per year to 10 tons per year. This is for what's called major source permitting, which is the most stringent permitting under the Clean Air Act. And it means that a lot more sources of air pollution will have to be subject to that permitting. A lot of oil and gas sources, 10 tons per year is not a lot of pollution. And it will inevitably require companies to meet even more stringent control requirements, but also to offset their emissions under the Clean Air Act, which that's a key goal that we need to achieve, is that the state keeps permitting more pollution and we're not offsetting anything. We need to start offsetting things and getting industry to realize that if it wants to drill a well, then it's got to remove 5 others. That needs to be the norm. And that's an important tool for advancing phase out, not the be all end all, but if we can use offsets to start to reduce the oil and gas industry's infrastructure, that's good. And an extreme classification can help set the stage for that to happen.
And since I have jumped in, I am going to just ask, I feel like this is perhaps a little naive, but I don't know enough about the political situation with Governor Polis. Do you feel that request you made today, is that something that sort of gives Polis a little political cover? I mean, is he likely to sign it and get those emergency, I'm not sure if I'm asking this very well, but given that we know Polis is out kind of watching oil and gas's back, is he likely to declare this emergency or ask the EPA to declare this?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. If I was a total cynic, I wouldn't be in this line of work. I maintain some degree of optimism, even in the face of tremendous odds. I think that there's a chance the governor could see that it's the right policy move. The state, to their credit, has not tried to sugarcoat as much how bad of an ozone year this was. In the past, they've tried to blame wildfires or say that it was some unusual phenomenon. I've been heartened to hear from air officials that they recognize that much more needs to be done, and that it wasn't caused by wildfires. And so that's the right narrative. That's the truth. But I'm heartened that they have not tried to sugarcoat it otherwise. So there seems to be recognition that much more needs to be done. Is the ask a big ask? Yes, it is, because it would change the regulatory landscape in a big way, but in a necessary way. And obviously, the landscape has changed already in big ways because of ongoing ozone pollution problems. So we think there's a chance. We're making the case, but we'll see. And either way, like, we've put an idea and a proposed solution before the governor, so hopefully he'll take it seriously, because we can't just keep complaining about the problem. We need to offer those solutions. So hopefully it will be met with some degree of openness.
Great. And I'm going to let you get back to the questions, but if you could be sure, Jeremy, before you sign off, to let us know how we can support that issue and that effort, if it's having us put out an action alert or forward yours.
For sure. Yeah, no,
Great.
thanks. There's more to be done. A letter is not the be all end all. So we need to keep the pressure on, especially as, and I know Mike Foot's on attending today, and Mike's very involved in these issues as well, and knows full well that there's a lot of pretty significant rulemakings coming up that are all about trying to do more to reduce ozone pollution along the Front Range. And so very critical opportunities to engage and to ensure that the Polis administration does the right thing. It's Governor Polis's legacy here that's on the line, and so hopefully he recognizes that. He's made lots of bold statements to the effect of, we need to deal with this problem, we need to do it right, we need to do it effectively. Hopefully he'll enable his regulators to live up to that, to those bold statements. So there will be opportunities, so stay tuned for more there. Lauren asked about the cumulative impacts rule, and I'll be totally honest, bandwidth wise, the center hasn't had a chance to really track that too closely, or to really engage. So I don't have any comments right now, Lauren, but I know that other groups, 350 Colorado, others have worked really hard on that rulemaking to try to make cumulative effects mean something, not just a consideration, but actually an action forcing consideration. And we'll see where the Energy and Carbon Management Commission goes with all that. So sorry, I don't have more specific thoughts or feedback there, but thanks for that question. And the letter too, I thought I might have sent that, but maybe I didn't I sent it in the answers. So the letter that we sent today that Leslie asked about and Lauren asked about, the link to it, I just included that in the answers section. Julie had some questions too, I noticed in the chat. I think I've gone through everything in the question and answer. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all who showed up tonight. Thank you so much. It's a great opportunity to be able to share more details around what we're doing. Julie, you had questions around incentives, technology that could be monitored remotely. Yes, probably some incentives, but we want to be cautious that incentives don't turn into subsidies. And if an oil and gas company can't afford to monitor its emissions, that company shouldn't be operating. And that's a reality that we try to adhere to in our advocacy work. This is not about cutting oil and gas companies slack or giving them a break. If they can't meet what they've promised to meet in terms of reducing air pollution, protecting people, protecting communities, then they shouldn't be in business. And that's just that's a fact. That's a truth. And so we need to make sure that we're staying true to that principle. But there could be some incentives out there, especially for researchers trying to develop new and better technologies, which leads to your second question there. There could be technologies that could be monitored remotely. What we really need are systems, though, that enable companies to both operate their systems remotely, not just monitor, but operate. Because if there's a problem, then things need to shut down so they can be repaired. And we don't see that that's often the case playing out. So, but we need to focus on that and the interplay between technology and incentives for sure. And related to that, you asked about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that though. Yeah, the IRA does a lot of things. I don't know what it does in terms of potentially supporting improved monitoring or verification of emissions. So sorry, I don't have any more insight there. Comment about the Air Commission. And yes, the reform of the Air Commission has been a focus of attention for a few years now. There's been talk about professionalizing the commission, so making it a paid commission as opposed to a volunteer commission, and changing the composition to ensure that industry doesn't wield as much influence. So yeah, but that would require legislation, and groups did try to push legislation that would have done that. This past session, it unfortunately was kind of wrapped up with the overall deal that was struck. But because reforming the Air Commission is not about oil and gas, it's about air pollution regulation writ large. Hopefully, it would not be viewed as interfering with any quote deal, and could be something that can both be put on the table and have a chance of being passed. But yes, the Air Commission, it should be reformed, but let's not forget that there's only one person who has appointed the current members of the commission, and that's Gov Polis. So he could have chosen to appoint different people. He could have made it an imperative to get people who are more reflective of communities who are impacted and who support aggressive climate action. He chose not to do that. And so let's, as much as we might need to focus on reform, let's not lose sight of the accountability that needs to be addressed at this point for Governor Polis.
Jeremy, this is Paul Conlon with Empower Our Future.
Yeah.
You're a star. Thank you so much for being on here. I notice we also have a very much star-studded audience.
Yes.
And it seems like if everyone could get together and work together, be tremendous power just among this group here, let alone every environmental group in Colorado. Do you have any thoughts off the top of your head about leveraging all the power we have?
Well, thankfully, a lot of us do work together pretty regularly, which is great. But obviously, we always need to make sure that tent is as big as possible on these issues in particular. I mean, what you're doing here with the Empower Hour and Empower the Future is wonderful. Because look at this, we're realizing this, we got all these people together. Talking about these perspectives and ideas. This is great. We do need more of this. We need to, I don't know, we always need to be reaching out to each other and soliciting ideas and inviting engagement and opportunities to show up. We all engage in unique ways, and individually we are making some difference, but together, more collectively, we can obviously bring forward more power. So I know there's lists out there and everything, so I don't, we just need to continue to keep that up, keep the conversations going, keep ideas flowing on listservs and forums like this, and keep inviting others to engage in what we're doing individually. So I don't have any grand solution other than, like, obviously we need to organize, and we need to keep that up. Organizing doesn't just happen. Organizing is about evolution, and so let's keep that up.
Great, thank you.
There were a couple questions. I know folks probably have to go, and thank you so much for sticking with us, everybody who's still on. And Leslie had a question around Casey Becker, who is the regional administrator for the EPA here, EPA Region 8, which encompasses Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Montana. And I mean, I know many of us know Casey well, and know her personally, and know that she has a great heart and wants to make a big difference. And as when she was Speaker of the House, was really instrumental in getting some key environmental reforms passed, and the state's first round of climate legislation passed, which was amazing. As regional administrator, she's definitely changed the tone and has put EPA in a position to more reliably stand up for people and communities and to do the right thing. She is still subject to immense political pressure from the administrator in DC and the political forces there. She navigates that as best she can. Is she doing everything perfectly? No. But that's my job as an advocate, to be the one saying, and pointing out where she's falling short. But she's certainly, I would say, one of the best regional administrators we've had in Region 8. So I'm heartened by that. And I'm heartened that she's not forgot about Colorado. She's actually stuck her neck out in a couple of cases to hold the Polis administration accountable to what it should be doing. And it's really refreshing to see that. Past regional administrators probably would be less or more hesitant to do that.
Well, I saw a number of thank yous, Jeremy, from many of the attendees in the Q&A. Appreciate your time.
And thank you to everybody who attended, and just to acknowledge too, folks probably know my good friend Robert Kiley, who is an attorney, public interest attorney who worked with the center. I actually kind of filled his shoes when he retired last year. Robert is an excellent, amazing clean air attorney, and he has done so much to set the stage for us to continue to succeed with the Center for Biological Diversity and on advancing these issues in Colorado. Robert lives in the Sugarloaf area outside of Boulder, so he's very tuned in and plugged into what's going on in Boulder County. And I just have to acknowledge him because he's not on, but folks who know him know that he's a force, and it's amazing to keep his legacy evolving here. So. And I just want to say thanks to everybody who attended. I work with many of you. We collaborate together so often, and I look forward to keeping it up.
Say thank you so much for being our guest and also for all this amazing work you have been doing. It's tremendous. I also want to take a moment to thank the other Empower Our Future communication team members who are integral to making these Empower Hours happen. They are Paul Cullen, Chris Hoffman, Steve Whitaker, and Julie Zonizer.
Sounds like we're done for this evening. This is wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy.
Appreciate it.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.